Try sleeping outside in the rain tonight. No tent, no roof, nothing. You wouldn't last until morning. Your ancestors did it for entire seasons at a time, year after year, without a single modern tool you'd consider necessary just to survive one wet night. Modern rain is an inconvenience. You run from a car to a doorway. You grab an umbrella. In parts of the tropics and monsoon regions, rain fell for weeks without stopping, sometimes for months, and your ancestors lived through every single one of those nights without walls, without a mattress, without dry clothes waiting for them anywhere. So how did a species with no fur, no waterproof skin, and no shelter it didn't build with its own hands manage to sleep through that over and over for hundreds of thousands of years? Location. Long before your ancestors built anything, they were choosing where to sleep with an eye that modern humans have almost completely lost. Anthropologists studying surviving hunter-gatherer groups have found that campsite selection is treated with the same seriousness most of us give to buying a house. A slight rise in elevation, even just a foot or two, keeps floodwater from pooling underneath you. A rock overhang or a dense tree canopy blocks the worst of the downpour before it ever reaches your skin. Caves, when available, were prime real estate for exactly this reason: dry, wind-blocked, and defensible. Your ancestors weren't sleeping wherever they happened to stop walking. They were reading the landscape the way you might read a weather app, and the best sleepers in the group were the ones who read it correctly. This wasn't guesswork passed along casually either. Knowing which slope drained well, which tree canopy actually held up under sustained rain, and which ground turned to mud within an hour was survival knowledge, tested and refined across an entire lifetime, and then handed down to the next generation before they ever needed it. A group that camped in the wrong spot during a heavy season might lose gear, lose warmth, or lose a member to exposure. A group that camped in the right spot barely noticed the storm at all. Over enough generations, that difference in knowledge became the difference between a lineage that continued and one that didn't. Then there was the shelter itself. This is where it gets stranger than most people expect, because ancient shelters were often better engineered for rain than a lot of modern camping gear. Archaeologists have found evidence of shelters going back over 400,000 years, structures made from branches, bark, and animal hide, angled specifically to shed water rather than collect it. The angle mattered more than the material. A steep enough slope on a hide roof does almost everything a modern tent does, moving water off the surface before it can soak through. Groups living in wetter climates layered broadleaves like shingles on a house, each one overlapping the one below it, channeling water outward instead of letting it drip straight down. This wasn't improvised on the spot during a storm. It was built in advance, maintained, and passed down, generation after generation, as functional architecture. And then there was fire, which did something you might not expect. Keeping a fire burning through a rainstorm sounds almost impossible, and for a fire out in the open, it usually was. But your ancestors weren't just trying to keep flames alive in the rain itself, they were building fires under overhangs, inside shallow caves, beneath dense canopy cover where the tree line did most of the work of keeping the rain off the coals. Some groups kept a bed of hot coals smoldering for days at a time, banked under ash to slow the burn, ready to be revived the moment conditions allowed. A fire that survives a multi-day storm isn't luck. It's a skill passed down as carefully as any other survival technique, and losing that fire could mean losing warmth for every person in the group. Here's where the story gets uncomfortable, though, because shelter and fire only solved part of the problem. Your ancestors still got wet, constantly. And staying wet for days at a time is genuinely dangerous. Hypothermia doesn't require freezing temperatures, just prolonged exposure to cold and damp. So how did they avoid it? The answer is body heat, shared deliberately and constantly. Multiple hunter-gatherer studies have documented what anthropologists call huddle sleeping, where an entire group, sometimes 10 or more people, sleeps pressed together in a single mass. This wasn't about comfort or affection, though it likely provided both. It was thermal engineering. A group of bodies sleeping in physical contact loses heat far more slowly than a single body sleeping alone, the same principle that keeps penguins alive in Antarctic winters. Children were typically placed in the center of the huddle, protected on all sides by adult bodies, while the adults on the outer edge absorbed the worst of the cold and the wet. This arrangement rotated. Nobody stayed on the exposed edge all night. The group functioned as a single thermal unit, redistributing risk so that no individual bore the full cost of a bad night. A single sleeping body, even wrapped in the best hide available, loses heat steadily through the night with nothing to slow that loss down. A dozen bodies sleeping together create something closer to a shared furnace, each person's body heat trapped and reinforced by the bodies around them, instead of escaping uselessly into the cold, wet air. Groups that huddled effectively could survive nights that would have been lethal to any one of them sleeping alone, which is likely part of why humans, unlike most solitary predators, evolved to sleep in tight social groups rather than scattered individually across a territory. Researchers studying sleep patterns before artificial light discovered that humans without electricity naturally split their sleep into two distinct phases, often with a period of quiet wakefulness in between. During a heavy rain, that middle-of-the-night waking period wasn't wasted time. It was maintenance. Someone in the group would wake, check the fire, adjust the shelter, shift a sleeping child away from a new leak, then lie back down. The group's sleep wasn't one long unbroken block that a storm could simply interrupt. It was a rotating watch built directly into the structure of how everyone slept, which meant a storm rarely caught the whole group unprepared at once. What's stranger still is how the body itself adapted. Populations living in consistently wet, rainy environments for thousands of generations show measurable physiological differences from populations that evolved somewhere drier. Some show subtle differences in skin oil production, which helps repel moisture slightly more effectively. Others show differences in how quickly their bodies generate heat through shivering and metabolic response, essentially a faster internal furnace built for a climate that demanded one. None of this made anyone waterproof, but it stacked the odds, generation after generation, in favor of surviving a wet night rather than dying from one. The climate itself, over thousands of years, quietly edited the population that lived inside it. There's a darker layer to this too, one that doesn't get talked about as often. Not everyone survived it. Infant mortality in prolonged wet seasons was measurably higher in some studied populations, and elderly members of a group were often the most vulnerable to hypothermia during extended storms. A single bad season, one stretch of storms that lasted longer than usual or arrived earlier than expected, could quietly reshape the makeup of an entire group by the time it ended. The systems your ancestors built, the shelter angles, the huddle sleeping, the rotating fire watch, weren't perfect. They were the accumulated best guesses of thousands of years of trial and brutal error, refined by the simple fact that groups who got it wrong didn't pass their knowledge down. You are descended specifically from the people who figured out how to keep a fire lit through a week of rain, and not from the people who didn't. And this is where it circles back to something happening inside you right now, tonight, whether or not it's raining outside your window. The reason you sleep more soundly during a storm, the reason rain sounds like white noise instead of anxiety, isn't an accident of modern comfort. For your ancestors, the sound of steady rain often meant predators weren't moving either, that the danger of the night had temporarily quieted along with everything else. Heavy, steady rainfall was, in a strange way, one of the safer sounds a hunter-gatherer could fall asleep to. Your brain still remembers this. It's why so many people today pay for apps that simulate the exact sound your ancestors were grateful to hear 100,000 years ago, huddled together under a hide roof, listening to a storm they had already learned how to survive. You will probably fall asleep tonight in a dry bed, under a roof that doesn't leak, without a single thought about whether the person next to you is helping keep you alive. Your ancestors never had that luxury. Every wet, cold night was a small collective negotiation between the group, the shelter, and the fire, one that had to be won again and again, storm after storm, for longer than any civilization has existed. And somewhere in your own body, in the way you crave warmth on a cold night, in the way the sound of rain makes your eyes feel heavy, that negotiation is still quietly,